Hey, welcome back. On the previous videos, we have built this application to keep track of our expenses. We're able to put down a description and an amount, and we're able to save that expense, as well as edit it or delete it as we please. Among other technologies, we're using React, Redux, .NET Core, Entity Framework, and an in-memory SQL database. On this video, we want to expand our expenses application by adding user authentication. We'll be creating a navigation bar, sign up, signing pages. We'll be using React Router to keep our UI and URL in sync. We're going to be using JWT tokens, and we're going to do a migration to create a new user table. Like always, the link to the repo is in the description. I can't wait to show you all this, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and let's get started. Before we start writing any code, I want to give you a high-level overview of what we're trying to accomplish. This way, you'll have a better picture in your head. So here we have the golden path for sign up. Over here we have the user, and it tries to sign up for an account, and we'll be making a post request to authentication/signup and pass in the username and password. With this information, if the username doesn't already exist, we create a new user in our database. If you notice here, the password is stored hashed for security purposes. Finally, the web API will respond with a token. I'll explain more about tokens later, but basically the token will be the way to get authenticated and authorized for any requests other than the sign up or sign in. Authentication verifies you are who you say you are, while authorization decides if you have permission to that resource or data. Now looking at the sign in golden path, we have our client trying to sign in, and we make a post request to authentication/sign in with the username and the password provided by the user. Then we go on to validate that user, and if the information is correct, we respond with a token. Now let's look at retrieving expenses golden path and see how that changes. As of right now, if we will make a request to expenses, we will get all the expenses in the database. Now that we have users, this changes up a bit because we only want to return expenses that are specific to our user. Now this is the flow we will have. Our client will make a request to retrieve all the user's expenses, and it would need to pass the token that got generated when they signed up or signed in. Once our web API knows who it is and is authorized, it will retrieve all the expenses related to that user and send that as a response. As of right now, we only have a single table which holds all of our expenses. So we will create a user table and have a one-to-many relationship since one user can have many expenses. As you can see in this example, we can say that because groceries and gift in our expenses table has a user ID of 2, these are all the expenses of the user Smith. With that said, the first thing we will be doing is a migration to create our user table in a relationship to the expenses table. I have opened Expenses.web API project in Visual Studio 2019. Again, the link to the repo is in the description. And the first thing we're going to do is create our user class. So we're going to right click right here on Expenses.DB, and we're going to add our user. All right, let's get rid of this since we don't need it and make this public. All right, so this class will represent our table in the database. So what do we want to have in it? We're going to have an ID, a username, and a password, minimum, right? But in addition, we can have something like an email, a date created, last time the user signed in, and things like that. Feel free to add whichever fields you like. In our case, we're going to add an ID, a username, a password, and might as well get an email. So let's start writing those. So an ID will be a key, and we'll have a public int ID get set. Another easy way to do this, if you do props or prop and then hit tab, it would autocomplete. And we can have a string and username get set. Prop, we'll have string and password. And lastly, let's do an email. And let's go ahead and import our attribute. Now that we have our user, let's head over to expenses and let's create our relationship. All we need to do is create a foreign key. So we can do foreign key. We can give it a name, user ID. Let's import this real quick. There you go. And then we'll do public user get set. Save that file. So next, let's add that to our app.db context. So right here, I'm just going to copy this line. And we're going to say user and users. And we are ready to run our migration commands. Let's do a quick build. So we can go to build and build solution. Let's now open our package manager console and make sure we are in Expenses.DB. And we're going to do add dash migration. Let's call it create user table. This file gets generated, and as you can see, user ID got added to the expenses table, and we're creating a new table called users. And all this stuff looks good to me. So now we're ready to update our database. Let's go ahead and do update database and hit enter. Okay, now that it's done, we can go to SQL Server Object Explorer and we can refresh this. You can actually click here, refresh databases, Expenses.DB, tables, and we should see our users and expenses. So if we do view data, we can see we have an ID, description, amount, and a user ID. And if we view the data of the users, ID, username, password, and email. Looking back at our design, we can see that we created our user table and we have a relationship between the user table and our expenses table. Now we can move on to create our endpoints, and let's start off with the sign up first. Back at our code, let's create a new controller. So we're going to right click on controllers and do add class. We're going to call it Authentication Controller. This controller will be set up very similar to the expenses controller. So let's derive from controller base. Make sure we have that. There you go. And let's add attributes, API controller. And let's set the route. So we'll say route. And in here we'll say controller. We mentioned this in previous videos. This will get the name of the file. So it would say Authentication Controller. So it would be, let's say, localhost colon the port number / authentication / whatever endpoints we have in here. Now in here, we're gonna have our endpoint. So we can do an HTTP post. And let's call it sign up. We can do a public, async, task, action results. And let's call it sign up. And this will take a user. And let's make sure we import this. So we can do using expenses.db. Next, we need some kind of user service to create our user. Let's start off by creating a user service interface. So we can right click right here in expenses core and do add, and we can do class. We can click on interface and we can do user service. Let's go ahead and make this public. So we'll have a signup method, and we know it's going to take a user. Let's import this real quick. And the return type of this method will be some kind of authenticated user object. This object needs to include the token that we are returning. Let's go ahead and right click on expense.core. Let's add a directory. Let's name it DTO. This stands for data transfer object. And in here, we're going to add a class. Let's call it authenticated user. We can get rid of this. Let's make the class public. And right here we can have a public string, and then of course we'll have our token. And we can also have anything else we want to return. Like for example, we can put a username. We can now go back to user service and finish typing here, we can do a task of authenticate a user. Make sure we import this and the task. Get rid of all this stuff we don't need and save this file. Now we can create the implementation. So let's right click on Expenses.core and do a new class. Let's call it user service. Let's go ahead and put it as public. And let's implement the I user service. Let's use dependency injection so we can access our context. So we can say private read-only app.db context. We can do public user service app.db context. We can say context equal to context. Now that we have the context, we can implement the signup method. And the first thing we should do is check that the username passed in doesn't already exist. And if it does, let's throw some kind of exception. All right, so let's get rid of this. We can do var check user equal to await context.user users. There you go. And then here we can do first or default async. Let's make sure we are using Entity Framework Core. And we have a u that username that equals to user that username. There you go. Let's mark this method as async. Now, if this returns a user, that means that a user already exists, and we do want to throw an exception for that. So let's see if we say if check user is not equal to null, then we want to throw a new exception. This will be a custom exception. This way we can catch it in the controller and we can return whichever status code we think is appropriate. So let's create a new directory called custom exceptions. Let's right click on expenses.core and do add new folder. And we can call it custom exceptions. And in here we can create a new class. Let's call it username already exists exception. Let's get rid of all this stuff we don't need. Mark this as public and inherit from exception. And all we got to do is using system, we need that. And all we got to do is generate all these constructors and we save this. Now we can go back to our service and throw a new username already exists exception. And we can pass in a message, say username already exists. So if the user doesn't already exist, then we're ready to store our user in the database. But before we can do that, we should hash that password. That way that password is not written down in the database as plain string. And for that, we're going to be using Microsoft's password hasher. Using dependency injection, we can do iPassword hasher. And let's install Microsoft.ASP.NET.Identity.Core. And then we can do password hasher. And we can do private read-only iPassword hasher, password hasher. We can now use this to hash our password. So down here we can do user.password equals to password hasher that hash password. And we can do user that password. Let's now add this user. We can do await context that add async. We can add the user and we can save this. So we can do context that save async. Remember, we need to save the changes in order for it to add the user successfully to the database. Last thing we're missing here is to return the authenticated user object. So we can do return a new authenticated user. And I think we have a username, so let's just have that for now. User that username. And we can do token. And we haven't generated our token yet, but for now, let's just do some test token. Let's now head back to our controller and call this method. We will need to inject our user service. So let's start by that. We can do private, read only, user service. And then we can do a public, authentication controller, user service. Make sure we are using this. There you go. And user service equal to user service. Now we can go ahead and use our service to create our user. Do result equal to user service that sign up, and we're going to pass in user. And we're going to return a created, and we're going to pass result. There you go. But if this ends up failing, we're going to wrap this in try and catch. And we're going to catch a username already exists exception. And in this case, we're going to return a status code 409, and we're going to pass in the message. A created will return a 201, which means a user got created in a database, and a status code of 409 means there is a conflict. Before we can run this, we need to go to startup and make sure we register all of our services. Let's go ahead and open startup. And down here, we can do services that add transient. We can do user service, since we're using that in our controller. And let's also add another transient. This will be password hasher. And we're doing using Microsoft ASP.NET.Identity. Save that file. We should now have everything set up correctly for our dependency injection to work properly. So let's give it a run and see what happens. Okay, so our Swagger page popped up and we're going to try to sign up a new user. So we're going to do username. Let's say we do John. Do password. We can do pass. Then we can do john@gmail.com. We don't need to worry about the ID, and then we can execute. All right, and we got a 201. We have a token, test token, and we have username John. Let's now try to hit that again and see if we get our exception. And we get a 409, username already exists. Everything is looking great. If we now go back to our database and check out the table, we should see, let's refresh this. we should see our new entry John. Expenses.DB, tables, users, view data, and we can see John, and we should see the password hashed and the email. So back to our design from the beginning, the sign up process is almost fully complete. The only thing we're missing is generating the token instead of having a test token as the response. But before we do that, let's jump into the sign in path first. So back at our user service, let's create another method here. Let's do a task. It's going to be returning authenticated user, sign in, and it's going to take a user. Okay, and then let's go to user service and let's implement that method. All right, so the first thing we got to do is get the user from the database by checking the username. So we're going to do context that users first or default. For username are the same. Let's make this method asynchronous. Now, if this returns null, that means the user doesn't exist, and we're going to be saying invalid username or password. If the password don't match, we're also going to say invalid username or password. Let's go ahead and do an if statement here. We can do if db user is null. We can do or password hasher that verify password, and then we can pass db user that password, and we'll pass user that password. And then if that's equal to password, verification result that failed, then we're going to throw a new exception. Just like we did for the sign up, this is going to be a custom exception. So let's add a class and let's call it invalid username password exception. Let's now set it to public exception, and let's generate all these constructors, and we can get rid of the stuff we don't need and save this file. We can now return to our user service and throw a new invalid username password exception, and we can say invalid username or password. If we get past this block, that means that we have our user, so we can just return a new authenticated user, username equal to user that username, and we have our token, which we still haven't created, but we're going to do test token. Let's head back to our controller now and create that endpoint. So we can say HTTP post, and we can call it sign in. We'll do public async task action result, and we'll do sign in, and then we'll have user, and in here we'll have a try and catch, and this will be invalid username password exception. We'll have E, and then we'll return a status code of a 401 and the E that message. And in here we'll have a var result equal to await user service that sign in, and we pass in user, and we'll return an OK result. An OK response is a 200 status code, and a 401 is unauthorized. We can now try to run our application and test it out. Let's click on authentication, sign in, and then we can do try out. We can have a username of John and a password pass. This is the one we created earlier. Click on execute, and we get a 200. We get a test token and username John. Say we put pass with capital S at the end. We execute and we get a 401, invalid username or password. Great. Let's go ahead now and generate our JWT token. With JWT tokens, we can securely transmit information as a JSON object, and this information can be verified and trusted because it is digitally signed. Our JWT will be created with a secret key which is privately stored in our server. When we receive a JWT from the client, we will verify the JWT is authentic with the secret key we have stored. We will have a claim with the username. This way we will know who the user is and we can do any requests related to our expenses this way. Keep in mind we don't want to store any sensitive data in here since the data is visible. Here's an example. So right here we have a token, and inside the token we can just see the payload or the data in here, and we see that it has a name, John Doe. If you want to learn more about JWT and get more in depth, you can click right here on introduction and you'll have a pretty good starting point. Back at our code, let's create some utility class that would take care of generating our token. Let's right click on expenses.core and add a new folder. Let's call it utilities. Inside utilities, we're going to have a new class. Let's call it JWT generator. Let's make this class public and static. And inside here, let's create a public static string generate user token. And we're going to pass in a username. Let's now create our claims. New claim. Let's import this. And we'll pass in username. So right here, we're creating a claim with our username. Keep in mind, you can have other claims such as if the user is an admin and so forth. Then we can return generate token. And this is a method we are about to create. And we're going to pass it our claims, and we're going to pass it what time do we want it to expire. So tokens expire after a certain time. So we'll have a date time that you see that now, and then I'll have it expire in 1 day. So right here we can have a private static string generate token, and this is going to take in claim, array, and date time. And to generate our token, we're going to be using the JWT security token handler class. So let's do var token handler equal to new JWT security token handler. And we're going to install the package system.identity model.tokens.jwt. There you go. Now we need a secret to create our JWT. So let's add that to environment variables. So let's head over to launch settings. So under properties, click on launch settings. And right here, we can write JWT secret. We can have, this is my super duper secret. And then we have a JWT issuer. And we can call it my expenses. Copy that. And let's paste it down here. and save this file. Go back to this file, and now we can pull the secret and the issuer. I would normally use iOptions to retrieve those values, but to save time, let's just use the environment. Environment.get environment variable. And then we can do JWT secret. And similarly, we can do the issuer environment variable, and then JWT issuer. Let's encode our secret. We can do encoding get bytes secret. And now let's create our token description. Security token descriptor. Make sure you're using Microsoft.identitymodel.tokens. Let's now have our subject. This will be a new claims identity claims. This is where we use the claims we created previously. And we set the expires. Let's now do issuer. And finally, we can do signing credentials. This will be equal to a new signing credentials. This will be a new symmetric. There you go. We pass in the key. And then we use the security algorithms. And we can do this one. And let's do a semicolon here. Okay. All we have left is to create and write our token. So we can do var token equal to token handler that create token. And we pass in the token descriptor. And finally, we can just return token handler that write token, and we pass the token. This is great. We finished generating our token. Now what we gotta do is call it in our services. So let's save this file and head over to user service. And right here, you can replace this by JWT generator. Let's make sure we're using that. And then generate user token. And we're going to pass in user.username. Let's copy this line and go over to the sign up and do the same thing here. Save this file. And now let's run the program and see what happens. Okay, so let's click on authentication, sign up. Let's try to sign up a new user. So we can say here Smith and password pass2. And let's click on execute. And we get a 201 and we get our token. Let's now try to log in. Try out. We can do John this time. And we'll do a pass. And click on execute, and we get our token as well. Let's copy this token and head over to jwt.io website. Back at the website, let's paste that token in here. So we can do paste, and we can see the information specific to our token here. We can see the name is John, and the issuer is My Expenses. Now back to our web API, let's head over to startup file, and let's set up our authentication middleware. In configure services, let's pull our secret, environment variable. Let's get JWT secret, and let's get our issuer. JWT issuer. We can now add our authentication. So we can do services. Let's pass in options. And in here we can do options.default authenticate scheme. It's going to be equal to JWT bearer defaults. Let's install this Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer. And let's also use that. And then we can do authentication scheme. Next, let's do default challenge scheme. And then we'll do JWT bearer defaults that authentication scheme. Then let's add JWT bearer to options. And in here we can do options that token validation parameters equals to new token validation parameters. Make sure I using that. And now in here, we want to have the validate issuer signing key to true. And then we can set the valid issuer. This will be the issuer. We can have a validate audience as false. And lastly, we can do issuer signing key. UC metric, security key, and then we can do encoding let's be using that get bytes secret. Okay. Last bit is to put it right here in our configure. So we can do app.use authentication. And the order matters since this is a pipeline. So make sure you have it above authorization. Let's save this file. And we can now have the authorize attribute in our expenses controller. This way only valid users with a JWT token can access those resources. So let's go ahead and open expenses controller. And up here, we can say authorize. And let's include that package, Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authorization. Now, in order to hit any of these endpoints, such as create expense, get expenses, and so forth, you need a valid JWT token. Now, an easy way to test this would be to use Postman. With Postman, we can test our endpoints and we can add our JWT to make requests. Right now I have Postman open and I have the URL to get all the expenses. And if I click on send, we're gonna get an authorize. This is because we don't have any valid token as part of the request. So let's go back to Swagger and try to sign in and get a token. So back here, let's click on sign in, try out. I wanna sign in as John. Password is pass, and I'm gonna execute and copy the token. And let's head back to Postman. Now it's really easy to add our token in Postman. All we gotta do is click right here, authorization, pick our bearer token, and paste our token in here. Click send, and right now we got a status okay, and the response is an empty object, and this is because we don't have any entries in our database. Now, before we can perform any operation on our expenses, we need to modify the expenses service to have a relationship between expenses and users. And this should be the last piece we're missing in the backend. Back in our web API, let's open up our expenses services. Before we can associate expenses to our user, we need to know who the user making the request is. And for that, we're going to be injecting HTTP context accessor Make sure we're using that. And then for that, we need to install Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.http.abstractions. Okay. And over here, we can have a private read-only DB user. And this will be our user. And down here, we can say the user be equal to context that users first where username is equal to http context accessor that http context that user that identity that name. And this username is the one we have embedded in our JWT. And now that we know who the user is, we can start with the create expense method. The create expense method will need to take a DB expense, and inside here, we'll say that the expense user is equal to the user. This user we got up here. And now, of course, these two are the same, but now this will have to be a DTO expense that we create because we don't want to return our expense along with the user information. And before I create that DTO expense, I want to run the program and give it a test so that you see what I'm talking about. So let's register iHTTP context accessor in startup so that then we can test it. So if we go up here, we can add a transient. I'm going to paste that in there. I'm going to paste that in there. Take the I out and make sure I'm using this. And I'm going to save this file and I'm going to run our backend. Now, if we look at our Swagger page and we expand the post, we're going to see that we have this object now. We have ID, description, amount, and then we had a user inside with an ID, username, password, and email. Let's try this out. And I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go to Postman. I want to make sure this is not the desired outcome that we want. This is just to test and see what is happening if we leave it as is. So we're going to click on body and go to raw and then change this to JSON, paste that in there. And then we can give a description, say credit card, an amount of 10. And obviously still have that same token we used earlier, so that should work. And then I'm going to change this to a post and I'm going to click send. Now I got created. We have an ID of 4, credit card, amount 10, but then we got our user back. We have ID, username, and even the password. This is obviously not desired, so let's go back to our application and fix this. So back to our application, let's create a new class inside DTO and call it expense. Let's get rid of this. Make the class public. And we can head over to expense in Expenses.DB and we can copy these properties. That way I don't have to type it. And let's paste it in here and save the file. Let's now head over to iExpenses service. And in here we can delete this, since now we're going to be returning the expenses.core.dto instead. Now for the create expense, since this is a brand new one, it doesn't really matter. And it's probably best if we just take a DB expense. So let's leave that as is. Now let's go back to the implementation and make sure we update this. So we can get rid of this. And now we can import the DTO instead. And this will be db.context. Same here. Okay, this looks good. Now the create expense method right now is returning a db.expense, and we need to return a dto.expense. And that's all we have left. So for this, we're going to parse it to expense. And if we see the suggestion, there's a way to generate an explicit operator. So we're going to hit that, and let's go back to expense, and we can see that this got generated for us. Now we can return a new expense. And let's change this from V to E. And then we can say that the ID will be the ID of that E.ID. That amount will be equal to that E.amount. And description will be equal to E.description. So now we have it parsed. Now if we go back to expenses services, we can see that this syntax now works. Moving on to the next method, delete expense. We can now do var db expense, because first we need to get the expense from db. So we can do expenses, that first. And then we're gonna make sure that the user ID matches our user ID, because if not, then a user with a token can delete some other user's expenses, and we obviously don't want that. So the IDs of the user needs to match, and then the EID need to match. Once we have this, all we gotta do is pass this in, and everything stays the same. The next method is the edit, and we also want to do the same thing. So let's copy this and paste it in here. The ID needs to match and the expense ID needs to match. Once we do that, we update description and amount, and then we save the changes. Then at the end, we just have to return our expense. The next one will be get expense. We can get rid of this. And right here, we can do context, that expenses, and then we can do where. Where that E.user.id matches our user.id, and E.id matches our ID. Then we can select and parse our expense, E, and select the first. Again, very similar pattern as before, where we check the user ID to make sure that that expense is specific to that user, and then we parse the expense to be a DTO.expense. Next, we'll do the get expenses, and on this one, we can copy all this stuff pretty much, and we can do little tweaks. And in here, all we need is to compare the user IDs, but we don't have any specific ID, obviously. And then lastly, we can do a to list. Let's make sure we save all of our files, and let's head over to Expenses Controller. And in here, we can change this to core.dto. And if we go down here, this one does need to be db.expense. And we save this file, and let's run our application. We're back at Postman. I'm going to delete this and do a post request. Let's see what we get. Okay, now we get a response, and now we only have the ID, description, and amount. This is much better. Let's try to do a get now. So we'll do a get and do send. And we have this to expenses for this user. And if we put an ID at the end, let's say we do 4 and we hit send, we only get that one. Now let's try to delete that and do a put. And I'm going to change this to 100 and put ID of 4. Send. Okay, we're getting a 200 and we're getting an amount of 100. Last thing I'm going to do a delete, and I want to delete ID number 5. So I'm going to send it and we get a 200. And now if we do a get, we should only have that one with 100. There you go. Let's try to create a new expense with our Smith account. So let's try to log in. I believe it was pass 2. Yes. And we got our token. And let's use this token in Postman now. So back at Postman, let's do a post, change the authorization token, change the amount to 33 and send it. Let's now get rid of ID just so we don't have any issues, and click send. And we get ID of 6, credit card, and amount 33. So if we do a get, there you go, we only have 1. And if we go back to our tables, we can see we have 2 expenses. One of them is for user 4 and the other one is for user 5. With this, we have finished the backend part. So now we're ready to start working on front end. I went ahead and opened our expenses front end project in Visual Studio Code. Keep in mind that the link to a repo is in the description below. There's a few things we need to do to complete the front end, but we'll take it a step at a time. So let's start by creating an authentication slice file. We'll make use of the create slice function from the Redux toolkit. For this part of the state, we'll have a token and some flag that states whether the user is logged in or not. The token will hold our JWT. With that said, let's go ahead and create our authentication slice. So let's right click on app, do a new file, and then we can do authentication slice.js. Let's go ahead and import our create slice from Redux JS toolkit. Let's export const authentication slice. And we're going to be calling this create slice function. Let's go ahead and give it a name. We can call it authentication and an initial state. And in here, we're going to have a token. This will be our JWT. And we'll have a is logged in. Initially, it will be set to false. Next, let's have our reducers. We'll have 2, one for when the user is authenticated, and the second will be for logout. So let's start with user authenticated. And we'll pass a state and an action. And in here, we want to use our session storage to set this token so we can persist it. From payload, we'll get that token. And then we're going to return state. I'm missing one right here. Okay. There you go. So state, and we'll have a token, action that payload, that token, and is logged in will be true. Cool. The second one will be a logout. And this is only going to do the clearing of the token. So back at it again. When the user authenticates, we'll store the token in our session storage. This way, if the user refreshes the page, we still have that token. And we'll put in the state our token, and we'll set this as logged in as true. And when the user logs out, we just clear the session storage. Okay, so let's do the export of user authenticated and logout. from authentication slice.actions. And lastly, let's export default authentication slice that reducer. Let's go ahead and open store now and add it to our store. So we can do authentication slice, and we can just give it the same name, and then we can import it here. We can put it here. Import authentication slice from authentication slice. If we now run our application, we can see that we have our authentication slice, and inside here we have our token and it's logged in. Let's now generate a authentication service similar to this expenses service that we have created here. Our authentication service will have a call to our sign up and a call to our sign in endpoints. Since we're going to be using the same base URL, we should pull this out to a .env file. You can go ahead and right click right here on expenses front end and do a new file, and let's do .env. Now we can go ahead and name it. We can name it React app base URL, set it equal to our base path. We can go back to our expenses service and update this now. We can do process that environment that React app base URL There you go. So now we'll be pulling the base URL from our environment. If you currently have the application running, you will need to stop it and rerun it for you to take this change. Let's go ahead now and create our authentication service file. So let's go ahead and right click on services and new file, and let's call it authentication.js. Similar to the expenses service, let's go ahead and import Axios. And in here we can do Axios instance. And then we can give it the base URL. And very similarly, we're going to do the same thing. And it'll be process.env that React app base URL / and then this will be authentication. This is the controller that we generated in our backend. So this is the path. Now let's do our sign up. So we can do export const sign up equal to async. And we're going to be passing a dispatch and some credentials. And in here we'll have a try and catch. And for now we can just console log error. If something goes wrong. There you go, trying to auto format. All right, so right here we're going to be making our API call. So we can get the response. So it's the data equal to await Axios instance that post, and then we're going to be hitting sign up, and we're going to be passing the credentials. Finally, if this succeeds, we want to dispatch the user authenticated action, and we pass the data. Notice how user authenticated got automatically imported for me, but if it didn't for you, make sure you import it. Next, let's do the sign in. So we can do export const sign in. This is going to be async, and we're going to be passing a dispatch and some credentials. Similarly, we're going to do a try and catch. and we're gonna console.log error. And in here, we're gonna be making our API call. So let's do const get the response data, and we're gonna be equal to await Axios instance that post, and we're gonna be hitting sign in credentials. We're passing the credentials, and finally we're going to dispatch user authenticated, and we pass the data. Oops, I'm missing a / before sign in. There you go, and save this file. So let's recap real quick. So for a sign up or sign in, it's pretty similar. So we get a dispatch and we get the credentials. So say for the sign up, we make an HTTP post to sign up, and we pass in credentials. This would be the user information, the new user information. And then as a response, we're going to get a token back, which we're going to be dispatching this action and setting this token. For the sign in, it's pretty similar as well. We get a dispatch and we get credentials. We get a username, password, and we make a post request to sign in. We get the response, and the response is the token. And we dispatch this user authenticated, and we pass in that token. Now that we have our authentication service, we can make use of it in our sign-in page and sign-up pages. So we can start off with the sign-in page first. So under components, let's right-click and create a new file. Let's call it sign-in page.js. In here, we can do const sign-in page. We can return a div that wraps a form. Let's give it some kind of title. So we can do an h4, and then we can give it some style. And we can set text align center. There you go. And we can say welcome back. Then we can have an input group. And this input group will have a class name MB3. And inside here, we can have a form control. And we'll give it a placeholder of username. Okay. So let's copy this, paste it down here. This one will be very similar, but instead of username, we'll have a password. There you go. Now towards the end, we can do a button, type, submit, variant, primary, and we can give it a style. So we can say margin is auto, display be a block, width would be 10 rem, and then this will be the sign in. Okay, one more thing we should do here in password that I missed is to make it a type equal password. This way it would not show the actual characters. Let's actually add some style in this div. So we can say style equal, and we'll give it some width of 30 rem, margin, auto, and padding top 8 pixels. Make sure we finish importing everything we need. So we need the form and button. Okay. And down here, we can export default sign-in page. Now, I know we're not done here, but it would be nice to know how the page looks like. So we can head over to app.js and we can try to comment this stuff out for the moment. Let's put the sign-in page here. And then we're going to import it. From components / sign in page. Okay, save that file. Now, if we go back to our browser, we should have something like this. It says welcome back and gets a username and a password. And if we start typing here and password, you will not able to see the characters, and you can obviously click sign in. Now let's try to wrap it up and finish the sign in page. Okay, so we'll get here we'll have a username and set username. And we're going to be using the useState hook. And we'll have another for password. Set password. And we're going to be using the useState hook. Remember, the useState hooks, how it works is this is the variable, and basically this is a function. You call this function and you pass in, let's say, a string, and this variable will be set. And we want to call these functions every time the user types something in our input box. So we're going to do onChange. We're going to get an event, and then we're going to say set username to that event, that target, that value. Very simple. So let's copy this, and we can do the same thing for the password. We can say onChange. We're going to set the password to that event, that target, that value. Now, as the user types, we're going to be recording the username and password. The next thing we got to do is implement the onSubmit. So this is going to take an event. And inside here, first thing we want to do is event.prevent default. This way we don't refresh the page. And then we just want to call our sign in. So we want to call sign in and pass in the dispatch and pass in the username and the password. This is our sign in from the authentication service, and it takes a dispatch and it takes some credentials. Let's make sure we are using dispatch, and then we import everything that we need. So dispatch equal to use dispatch. There you go. The use dispatch is another hook, and we import that from React-Redux. So let's do import use dispatch. From React-Redux. We also need to import useState, and we can do that by saying import useState from React. The next thing we gotta import is the sign-in from the authentication. So let's do import sign in from our services / authentication. Save that file. So that's a quick recap. So we have this form, the sign in form. When the user clicks sign in, then we're going to call the sign in method or function inside of this authentication file that we have created. And then we pass in the dispatch and we pass in the credentials. Let's now head over to our browser and give this a try. Okay, so we're back at the browser and I'm going to be signing in with one of the users we have created previously. So I'll say John and pass, that's the password. And I'm going to click sign in. Okay, so I'm going to check this Redux DevTools. And we can see that this action got triggered. And if we check the state, we're going to see that we have this token and the user is logged in. Another thing we can see is the session storage. If we go to application and we go to session storage and we click on this, we're going to see that our token was also saved here. If you get an error, make sure you have your backend service running. Now that we have the sign-in page working, the sign-up page should be a lot easier to implement. So let's go back to our code and do that. Since the sign-up page will be very similar, let's copy all this code and let's create a new file under components. Let's call it signup page. .js. Let's paste our code in here. And we can change everywhere where it says sign in to sign up. So we can do a find right here, expand this and do sign up. And then we can change that one, that one, that one, and that one. There you go. Also, the button should be sign up. And let's make it success. Okay. Now, in addition to username and password, we want to get the email and the confirm password. So let's do const email set email equal to use state. And I'm going to copy this, paste it down here. And I'll say confirm password. And this will be set confirm password. There you go. Now let's create those two inputs. So we can copy the username one. And down here, we can say this is an email. And then we're going to be setting the email. There you go. And then we can do the same thing for the password. We can paste it down here and we can say this is for confirm password. And this will be type password. So I'm going to copy this from above, put it here. And then this will be set confirm password. A nice thing to do would be to disable the submit button in case the password don't match. So we can say disabled equal to password not matching confirm password, or if password that length is less than or equal to 0. There you go. And lastly, let's not forget to also pass the email in the request. So we can say email and let's save this file. Let's head back to app.js and now let's comment out sign in page and let's try to do sign out page. Okay, let's make sure we import that. Sign up and sign up. All right, let's save this file and head back to our browser. Okay, so back at the browser, we can see the state is clean. So let's create a new user. Let's say we call this guy John2. John2@email.com. And then I'll just say password or pass. See if I type an extra character, it disables the button. So now if I click sign up and we go to the state, we see that we get a token and it says that it's logged in. Great. Let's take a look at the session storage and make sure we have the token. We go to application, session storage, and we do have the token. So back at our code, this code that we have commented here is starting to feel like a component itself. So why don't we copy this and we move this to a homepage component. Let's right click on components and do a new file. And let's call it homepage.js. There you go. Now in here, we can do const homepage and then we can put all this stuff in here. Let's take that comment off. All right. We can do export default home page. There you go. All right, I'm gonna go back to app and I'm gonna copy the stuff that I need from here, which are these two and the, actually I'm gonna copy all and then I'll take off whatever I don't need. So I'm gonna paste it in here, and obviously we don't need to sign up or sign in. And we are done with this component. So now we have reached an interesting part of this application where we need to display different components depending on the URL. And for this, we're going to be using Reac-Router-Dom. It allows for your application to navigate between different components by changing the URL, and it keeps it on sync. Let's go ahead and open new bash, and let's do npm install Reac-Router-Dom. Now that I finished installing, let's go back to app and let's get rid of all this stuff. And inside here, we can do return. And we're going to return a browser router. This is going to wrap everything. And inside here, we have a switch. And it's capital S. Now inside our switch, we're going to specify our paths. So let's start with the first one. So let's say route and say exact path equal /. This is just a route. And then we're going to render. And we're going to do a little function here. And then we want to render, if the user is logged in, we want to render at the home page. If the user is not logged in, we want to render the sign in page. We know we have that is logged in Boolean on our state. So let's make sure we pull that out. So we can do const is logged in. And we're going to be using the use selector. This is how we pull things from the state. And then we'll say state that authentication slice have an extra E is logged in. There you go. So now we can say if it's logged in, then we want to render the home page. Else, we want to render the sign in page. Let's make sure we close that. There you go. Now the next route would be for the path sign up, and we want to render so if it's logged in, we want to redirect to homepage. So this will be to the root. It will be homepage or sign in page, right? So this condition will take care of it. Else, we just want to render the sign up page. I'm gonna actually copy this since the next one's pretty similar. And right here, I'm gonna say sign in. And this stays pretty much the same. We're gonna have a render, and if it's logged in, then we're gonna go to the root. Else, instead of sign up, we wanna go to sign in. There you go. And lastly, we'll have a route. Say this is a component. And then we'll give it an h2 here and say page not found. So in case it doesn't match any of the routes, it's going to say like, hey, page not found. That page doesn't exist. So let's recap real quick. So this is our route. And if the person is logged in, it's going to show the home page. Else, it's going to show the sign-in page. If they're trying to go to sign up, if they're logged in, it's going to redirect them to the route. And most likely it's going to return the home page, but it's still going to evaluate this. Else, it's going to render the sign up page. Same with sign in. If you try to go to sign in, it's going to redirect them to the route if they're signed in. Else, it's going to show them the sign in page. And if you put like anything that doesn't match any of these, then it's just going to say page not found. Let's now import everything that we are missing. So we have browser router, redirect. We're missing route and switch. We don't need this guy or these two. Okay, and then we will also need the use selector. So let's import the use selector from React Redux. Save that. So down here is saying that I have an error in homepage. It doesn't find expense form. So let's go to homepage and fix that real quick. Since we're in the same directory, all we got to do is remove these components from here and just leave it as is. And same for the list. There you go. Save that. Now, if we go back to our browser and say we go to localhost and then the port and /signup, we're at the signup page. Say we refresh this, we stay in signup page. Say we want to go to sign in. So I'm going to change the URL to sign in, and sign in shows up, right? And if we look at our state, we can see that we're now logged in. All right, say we sign in, say we do John and do pass. So if we click sign in now, then it routes us to the home page, right? And don't worry about that error for now. But if we look at the state, we can see that we have the token and it's logged in equal to true, right? So if we were to do / or essentially refresh the page, this would send us back to the sign in. And this is because the page reloaded and we lost our state, right? So it doesn't matter that we put this or sign in, it will still show the sign in page. And we can still go to sign up if we want to. And it works. Say we put like a totally different route in the URL. Say we do some route. It would say page not found, which is what we want. Okay, so let's fix the issue of once you're signed in and you reload the page that we stay signed in if we are, right? So let me show that again. So if I say John, I do pass and I go inside, right? I'm logged in, but if I refresh a page, I lose my state and I'm automatically sent back to sign in. And this is why we are using the session storage to store our token. So let's use that and fix this. To fix this, what we can do is check if we have a token in session storage. And if we do, we'll say that the user is being authenticated and we use that token. And we can check if a token exists upon first time the app loading up by using a use effect. So we can do use effect. We pass in a function. And then we can say const token equal to session storage that get item. And we're going to get a token. And if the token not equal to undefined and token not equal to null, then we're going to dispatch user authenticated, and we pass in that token. As a second parameter, we pass an empty array. This is so that this only runs once. So let's make sure we're using the dispatch. So we can do const dispatch equal to use dispatch. And now let's make sure we import this. So I use dispatch. And also we would need the use effect. So we can do import use effect from React. Oh, I missed this. So make sure you make this an object. And now we can go back to the browser and test this. So now the browser, we can see that our state is clean and we don't have a token, and it says that it is logged in is false. So let's try to log in, John, and pass. We're logged in. And we can see that we have a token and is login equals true. Let's say we refresh this page and we're back at the home page. Great. Check the state and we see that we have our token and it's locked into true. We can now create our navigation bar. Our navigation bar will make it a lot easier to obviously navigate through different pages of our application, and it also allow users to log out. So we're back at the code, and under components, let's right click and create a new file here. Let's call it navbar.js. Let's start typing const navbar. All right, inside here, we're going to be needing the is logged in, and we also need a dispatch. So I'm going to write it, and you will see why in a minute. So is logged in. We're going to be using the useSelector hook. And we're going to get the state. And the authentication slice. Okay. And next, let's get the dispatch. There you go. Let's import those real quick. Use selector and use dispatch. And this will be from React Redux. Okay. We have those. Next, let's actually return our navbar. And we're going to be using a nav. This will have a class name equal to navbar. And we'll give a style of background color. We'll say it's E4FFF2. Just to give it a little touch. All right, and then in here, we'll have an H1. Let's give it some style as well. And we give a font family of brush, script, empty, cursive, and I'll call it my expenses. Okay. Now, in here, this is where we're going to be using our is logged in. Because if the user is already logged in, we want to display a logout. But if the user is not logged in, we want to have options for the sign up or sign in. Okay, so let's do is logged in. And if it's logged in, we want to have a button variant equal to link, and it's going to be an href equal to sign in. And on click, we want to dispatch logout. That way we clear we do everything that we need to do on logout. In our case, we're clearing that token from our session storage. And we say log out. There you go. Now, if the user is not logged in, then we want a div over here and have some style on it as well. Say display flex. And in here we'll have a nav link to, and this will be to our sign up. So I'll say sign up, and the next one will be a nav link to our sign in. Let's give it some style. We'll say margin left 1 RME. So make it look a little nicer. We'll say sign in. Let me format this real quick. Okay. Let's now import the things that we need. So we can say import nav and button from React Bootstrap. We can say import nav link from Reac-Router-Dom. And we can import logout from app/authentication slice. And all the way at the bottom, let's export default Navbar. So as a recap, the Navbar is pretty straightforward. We have a is logged in Boolean right here. And if the user is logged in, then what we're going to show is this button, which is a logout button. And if they click on this, we're going to dispatch this logout action. And we're going to href to sign in, meaning it's going to take them, the URL is going to change to sign in, and it's going to refresh the page. Else, we're going to have a sign up or a sign in nav link. And the nav link should not refresh our page. Before we hook this up, let's open up public and open index.html. And I want to change this title to be my expenses. And also I want to add something to the body. I want to add some style right here and say background color to be F5FFFA. All right, save that. Let's head back to our app.js. Now here, what I want to do is just display our navbar. So we can say navbar let me format this. And let's import this. We can say import navbar from components navbar. Save that file. And now if we head back to the browser, we're going to see our navbar, and we can click on sign up or sign in. And this, notice how it changes the URL. And then if we try to log in, say we do John, pass, and we sign in, then we're here. And we have this navbar, and we can see that we have the logout. It changed from sign up or sign in to logout. You can see state, we have token and it's logged in. And if we open DevTools, we can see in our application, we have our token. Now if we click log out, we see how that got cleared and we don't see it anymore. So if we refreshed, or even we try to go directly, we'll still go to sign in. Now notice how if I sign in again, we have been getting this error. It says error loading expenses. And this error is because we are not passing the token to make requests to retrieve the entries, the expenses for this user. So this will be the final step to complete this application. So let's go back to our code and do this. So far we have been getting the token and storing it in our app, but we haven't really put it in the headers to make further requests with it. Meaning every time we're going to request our expenses or create an expense or delete an expense, all of those needs to have a token attached to the request, making it the same as when we were doing this in Postman on the first part of this video. To do this, we're going to be using Axios Interceptors. These are functions that Axios calls for every request. Lucky for us, this is actually very easy to set up. So let's go here and say Axios instance .interceptors .request .use, and we're going to pass in a config. And in here, we're going to have config.headers equal, and then we're going to say authorization. There you go. Say bearer, space, and we're going to add the session storage .get item token. Format this and just return the config. And this is all we got to do. Now let's go back to the browser. Back at our browser, let's try to sign in, say John, and do pass. And now we get this expense. So we can try to edit this, and it works. And if we try to look at the network tab and make a new, say we do student loans and we do 500 and we add it, we can see that we're getting our request. And right here we say authorization and we're passing in the token. Very cool. Let's try out to sign up now. So let's say I'll do this. Okay, and I'll do pass. And I sign in, and there you go. And we have created a new account, and there you go, we have our token, and it says we're logged in. And with this, we have reached the end of this video. This video did take me a lot of time to record, and I'm very happy that you made it all the way to the end and to be able to share my knowledge with you. So if you enjoyed it and learned something from it, be sure to leave it in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll catch you all on the next one.